She wasn't looking for forever. She wasn't even looking for tomorrow. All she needed in that fragile moment was comfort, a heartbeat strong enough to silence her own. But when a single request collides with a chance encounter, one embrace becomes the spark of a story neither of them expected. Hello family, welcome to Folktales by Imzi. Please subscribe and like, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The rain fell in steady sheets, blurring the streetlights into hazy halos of gold and white. Lena Carter tugged her coat tighter around her body, though the thin fabric was already damp and clinging to her skin. Her heels clicked against the slick pavement, sharp at first, then faltering as her breath caught in her throat. It had been a long day, no, a long month. The kind that drains color from the world, leaving only shades of gray. Work had been unforgiving, her friends busy with their own lives, and the silence of her apartment had become unbearable since Darius left. Her breakup wasn't just a clean cut, it was a wound that refused to close. Every corner of her life seemed to echo with his absence, reminding her that love, as she'd known it, was gone. The storm outside mirrored the one inside her chest. By the time she ducked beneath the awning of a closed cafe, her curls plastered damp against her cheeks. She felt more exhausted than she could remember. She hugged herself, staring out at the glistening streets, when she noticed him. He stood at the far end of the awning, tall and still, hands tucked neatly into the pockets of a tailored coat. The rain seemed to bend around him somehow, as if the storm dared not touch him. His face was angled toward the street, expression unreadable, eyes fixed somewhere far away. He wasn't a man you could overlook. His presence filled the space even in silence. Lena's chest tightened. Something about the way he carried himself, steady, composed, only reminded her of how broken she felt. She tried to look away, fumbling with her phone, telling herself she should call a ride and forget this night altogether. But her hands shook, her throat burned, and the ache of loneliness pressed too heavily against her ribs. Before she could stop herself, the words tumbled out, soft, trembling, meant as much for herself as for him. "Pretend to hug me," she whispered. Her voice barely rose above the hum of the rain, but he heard. He turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers. Dark, calm eyes studied her, not with suspicion or pity, but with a quiet depth that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in weeks. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. Then he stepped toward her. Lena froze, breath hitching as he closed the distance. She hadn't expected him to move, not really. But suddenly he was there, his coat brushing hers, and then his arms wrapped around her. His embrace was neither hesitant nor invasive. It was sure, strong, steady, as if he understood without words what she needed most. Her cheek pressed against the firmness of his chest, and for the first time in weeks her body eased. Her shoulders sagged, her trembling slowed. The storm outside faded into a distant murmur, the wet streets and rushing cars forgotten. All that existed was the warmth of this stranger's arms, the heartbeat she could feel beneath his coat, the strange safety of belonging for just a moment. Time stretched, both endless and fleeting. She wished she could stay there, suspended in that fragile comfort. But eventually reality broke through. Heat flooded her cheeks, and she pulled back, fumbling for words. "I'm sorry," she murmured, unable to meet his eyes. That was ridiculous. But when she looked up, bracing for a smile of amusement or a frown of disapproval, she found neither. His expression remained calm, thoughtful, almost unreadable, as though he'd heard more in her plea than she'd said aloud. He gave a slight nod. No words. No questions. Then, as quietly as he had stepped into her life, he stepped back. His stride was calm, purposeful, carrying him into the curtain of rain as though he belonged to it. Lena remained beneath the awning, her arms tingling with the ghost of his embrace. She didn't know his name, his story, or why he had been standing there that night. All she knew was that for the briefest, most impossible moment, she hadn't felt alone. The storm had passed by morning, but Lena still felt damp inside. Her apartment smelled faintly of last night's rain, and the city outside her window buzzed with its usual Monday chaos. She moved through her small kitchen like a ghost, pouring coffee she barely drank, scrolling her phone without seeing a word. All she could think about was him, the stranger, the embrace, the quiet strength in his arms. It was absurd. She didn't even know his name, and yet his presence lingered, replaying in her mind every time her thoughts drifted. It hadn't been romantic, not exactly, but it hadn't been casual either. It was as if, in that moment, he had absorbed the weight she could no longer carry. And now, without him, the weight had returned, heavier than before. By the time Lena arrived at work, she had convinced herself it was best to forget it. She had bills to pay, tasks to juggle, a supervisor who already doubted her efficiency. Dreaming about mystery men who offered fleeting comfort wouldn't help her career. But the universe had a cruel sense of humor. That afternoon, while reviewing contracts for the upcoming Carter Foundation Gala, she spotted the name, Adrian Cross. The billionaire investor. The quiet force behind half the city's development projects. Always in the news for his philanthropy and impossible wealth. She'd seen his face in magazines before, heard whispers about his business empire, even gossiped about his private life with friends. But none of those glossy photos or headlines matched the man she had clung to in the rain. Her hands trembled as she flipped the folder closed. No way. The odds were impossible. Yet, when the office door opened and footsteps sounded in the hall, she knew before she even looked. It was him. He entered with the kind of presence that silenced a room without effort. His suit was perfectly cut, his expression composed, and his gaze, those same calm, dark eyes, swept the space before settling briefly, unmistakably on her. Lena's stomach dropped. Heat flooded her face as memories of her whispered plea surged back. Pretend to hug me. God, he must think she was insane. She tried to keep her head down, scribbling nonsense in her notebook as her boss launched into introductions, but she could feel him watching. Not staring, just noticing, as if he hadn't forgotten either. When it was her turn to shake his hand, her palms were damp. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and for a heartbeat the world shrank again, just like it had beneath the cafe awning. "Mr. Cross," she said softly. His grip was firm, steady. "Ms. Carter," he replied, his voice smooth, deeper than she remembered. Nothing more. No mention of the rain. No acknowledgement of the intimacy they'd shared with strangers' names still unknown. Yet something flickered in his eyes, a recognition, a quiet question left unspoken. And just like that, the air between them shifted. The rest of the meeting blurred around Lena, a swirl of numbers, budgets, and schedules she normally would have clung to for focus. But every time she tried to take notes, her pen hovered above the paper, her attention drifting back to the man sitting at the head of the conference table. Adrian Cross. He didn't dominate the discussion with arrogance, though he easily could have. Instead, he listened more than he spoke, his questions precise, his tone measured. He was a man used to command, yet there was something grounded about him, something that made people lean in whenever he did decide to speak. And Lena, despite her desperate attempts to remain invisible, couldn't stop remembering the way those same arms had held her in the rain. By the time the meeting ended, she was exhausted from pretending she wasn't unraveling. She gathered her files quickly, praying to slip out before Adrian noticed her again. But as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Ms. Carter." Her breath caught. She turned, pulse pounding in her ears. He stood a few feet away, one hand resting casually in his pocket, the other holding his phone. The room had mostly emptied, leaving only them and the faint echo of closing doors. "Yes, Mr. Cross?" she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. He studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "You're new here?" "Yes, sir. Just started last month." He nodded once, as though filing that away. "And how are you finding the work?" Lena blinked. Of all the things he could have said, small talk hadn't been what she expected. "Challenging," she admitted. "But I like it." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, so brief she almost doubted she'd seen it. Then he straightened, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Good. Challenges build people." Something in his tone made her want to ask what kind of challenges had built him. But before she could, her supervisor re-entered to retrieve a folder, and the moment fractured. Adrian gave her one last glance, then turned to leave, his stride as steady and assured as the night she first saw him. Lena exhaled, sagging against the conference table once the door closed behind him. What were the odds? Out of all the strangers in the city, the man she had begged for a pretend hug turned out to be her company's most important client. It felt impossible, unbelievable, dangerous. And yet, deep down, she knew one thing with startling certainty. This wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The days after their first meeting moved in a blur of late nights and endless preparations for the Carter Foundation Gala. Lena found herself juggling emails, vendor calls, and last-minute adjustments that seemed to multiply no matter how much she crossed off her list. Yet, no matter how frantic the pace, her awareness of Adrian Cross was constant. He appeared at the office for updates, attended walkthroughs of the venue, and joined strategy calls. Each time, Lena tried to keep her distance, but fate had a cruel way of placing them near one another. Her hands passing him a document, her voice offering a detail in a meeting, her gaze catching his across the room before she forced it away. And every time, she felt the ghost of his embrace from that night, steady and unshakable. One evening, long after most of the office had gone, Lena stayed behind to finalize the seating charts. The glow of her desk lamp cast the room in soft gold as she muttered under her breath, shuffling cards with names of donors and dignitaries who would fill the ballroom. She didn't notice the quiet footsteps until a deep voice broke the silence. "You're still here." She looked up sharply. Adrian stood in the doorway, coat draped over his arm, his tie loosened at the collar. He looked less like the untouchable billionaire and more like a man at the end of a long day. Lena straightened in her chair, suddenly self-conscious. "Just finishing some things." The charts weren't adding up. He stepped closer, glancing down at the chaos of names on her desk. "I could tell you not to push yourself," he said, "but I doubt you'd listen." Her lips curved into a small, surprised smile. "Probably not." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, but charged. Adrian's gaze lingered, as though he was searching for something in her face. Then he looked away, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said quietly. The admission was unexpected, raw around the edges. Lena tilted her head, curiosity tugging at her. "Good someone or bad?" He huffed a breath that was almost a laugh. "Good. Maybe too good." His eyes softened briefly before the distance returned, as if he'd shut a door on himself. Lena wanted to ask more. To know who that someone was, why speaking of them carried so much weight. But she also sensed that if she pressed, he'd retreat completely. So instead, she nodded, slipping her pen back into her notebook. "Well," she said gently, "whoever they were, they must have mattered." Adrian didn't respond right away. His gaze lingered on her once more, unreadable. Then he gave a brief nod. "They did." With that, he gathered his coat, leaving her with the echo of his presence and 100 questions she had no right to ask. When the door closed behind him, Lena leaned back in her chair, her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with seating charts. For all his power and polish, Adrian Cross was not untouchable. Beneath the sharp suits and quiet authority, he carried shadows. And Lena found herself wondering, dangerously foolishly, if those shadows might one day reach for her. The week of the gala arrived like a storm, pulling everyone into its frantic current. Staff rushed through the office with clipboards and phones pressed to their ears. Vendors called with emergencies, and Lena barely had time to eat more than granola bars between tasks. And yet, woven through the chaos, there was Adrian. He never hovered, never demanded her attention outright, but somehow their paths kept crossing. A quick exchange in the elevator, a shared glance across the ballroom as crews set up chandeliers, a brief conversation over coffee when both arrived earlier than expected. Each encounter was simple, fleeting, and still, each one left Lena carrying a spark of warmth that lingered long after. It wasn't just his presence. It was the way he listened when she spoke, even about the smallest details. It was the quiet humor he slipped into conversation, a rare smile breaking through the smooth veneer of his composure. It was the fact that, in a world of status and spectacle, he looked at her as if she were not invisible but seen. One afternoon, while reviewing the gala program at the venue, Lena found herself stuck atop a step ladder, fussing with crooked signage no one else had time to fix. She stretched to adjust it, biting her lip in frustration, when a deep voice rose behind her. "Going to redesign the whole ceiling while you're at it?" Startled, she nearly lost her balance. Strong hands steadied the ladder instantly. Adrian stood below, one brow raised, amusement flickering in his eyes. "I'm fine," she said quickly, though her pulse was racing. You were 1 second away from proving otherwise." His tone was calm, but the way he held the ladder betrayed his focus, sharp, protective. "I don't like crooked things," she muttered, tugging the sign into place. When she climbed down, he didn't step back right away. They were close, too close, and Lena had to tilt her chin up to meet his gaze. For a moment, it felt like the night of the rain again, the world shrinking to just the two of them. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, her voice caught somewhere in her throat. "Better." Neither of them moved. Silence stretched, thick and electric, until a passing staff member called her name, breaking the spell. She stepped back quickly, clutching her clipboard, her cheeks warm. Adrian released the ladder, slipping his hands into his pockets, his expression once more unreadable. But as he turned to leave, Lena could have sworn the corner of his mouth curved upward, just enough to let her know he'd felt it too. That night, lying awake in her apartment, Lena pressed a hand to her chest, her mind replaying every glance, every unspoken word. It was madness, she told herself, dangerous madness. He was a billionaire, her company's most important client, a man whose life existed in a world far beyond hers. And yet, when she thought of him, she didn't think of wealth or power. She thought of the man who had held her steady in the rain. The man who noticed when she was about to fall. The man who, without a single promise, was already beginning to change her. By midweek, the office buzzed with more than just gala stress. Whispers trailed Lena wherever she went, hushed voices falling silent the moment she entered a room. At first, she thought she was imagining it, chalking it up to exhaustion. But then she overheard two colleagues in the break room, their tones sharp with envy. "She's always around him," one muttered. "Don't tell me it's just coincidence." "Please," the other scoffed. "Women like her don't land men like Adrian Cross without shortcuts." Lena froze, coffee cup clutched tight in her hand. Heat rose in her cheeks, part anger, part humiliation. She wanted to march in and defend herself, but what could she say? That she and Adrian weren't involved? That all they'd shared was a hug in the rain and stolen glances that meant nothing. Except they did mean something, at least to her? She left the room without a word, the sting of their voices following her. The rumors only grew. A caterer made a snide comment about Lena's new position in life. A junior manager openly rolled her eyes when Lena entered a meeting. Even her supervisor began watching her more closely, as though waiting for proof of impropriety. And Adrian, if he noticed, he didn't show it. His composure was unshakable, his attention fixed on the success of the gala. But Lena couldn't shake the fear that the whispers would reach him, that he would believe them, or worse, that her presence might tarnish his reputation. That evening, she lingered at the venue after everyone else had gone, checking the table settings for the 100th time. The empty ballroom stretched wide and glittering around her, chandeliers glowing overhead like frozen stars. Yet the beauty only made her feel smaller, out of place, like an intruder in a world that wasn't meant for her. "You're still here." The voice startled her. Adrian stood in the doorway, his suit jacket off, his sleeves rolled to his forearms. He looked less like the polished titan of the city and more like a man who had carried the weight of too many days. "I was just," she gestured weakly at the tables, "making sure everything's perfect." He stepped into the room, his gaze steady on her. "It will be. You've done more than enough." She tried to smile, but her throat tightened. The words spilled before she could stop them. "People are talking." His brow furrowed slightly. "About what?" "About me. About us." She shook her head quickly. "Not that there isn't US. I mean, there isn't. But they think." "Let them think," he said, his tone calm but firm. Lena blinked, stunned. "You don't care?" Adrian held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "People will always talk. It's noise. What matters is what's true." Her breath caught at the certainty in his voice, the ease with which he dismissed the storm that had shaken her all day. For him, it was simple. For her, it was a war between desire and fear. Still, as he moved closer, stopping just short of touching her, the noise of the world seemed to fade. In his presence, the whispers didn't matter. The ballroom didn't matter. But as soon as he turned to leave, Lena's doubts returned, heavier than ever. Because what if the world's noise wasn't so easy to silence? What if, in the end, she wasn't strong enough to stand beside a man like him? The night before the gala, Lena sat alone in her apartment, the hum of the city leaking in through her half-open window. Her living room was cluttered with discarded notes, copies of seating charts, and the black dress she planned to wear tomorrow. She should have been proud. This event was the biggest project of her career. Instead, all she felt was the heaviness of doubt. The whispers at work hadn't stopped. They had multiplied, twisted, growing sharper the closer the gala came. Every laugh she shared with Adrian in passing, every time their eyes lingered too long, was fuel for gossip. And though Adrian brushed it off, Lena carried it like a stone in her chest. She stared at her reflection in the window. Just Lena Carter, 27, hustling to pay rent on a one-bedroom apartment, with a wardrobe full of department store clearance finds. And Adrian Cross? He was a man whose name opened doors, whose empire stretched across the city, whose life would never touch hers, should never touch hers. Her chest ached. Maybe the kindest thing she could do for herself was to walk away before the world tore her apart for daring to be seen near him. The next evening, at the gala's rehearsal, she nearly did. She found Adrian alone in the ballroom, standing before the stage as technicians tested the lights. His profile was etched in gold from the chandeliers, his posture as steady as ever. For a long moment, Lena simply watched him, memorizing the man she was about to lose. Then she drew a shaky breath and stepped closer. "Mr. Cross," she began, her voice softer than she intended. He turned, his eyes warming slightly when they met hers. "Lena." Her heart stuttered at the way he said her name, but she forced herself to continue. "I think, after tomorrow, it's best if I step back. From the project." "From," she faltered, unable to say from you. Adrian studied her quietly, his gaze sharpening. "Why?" She swallowed hard. "You know why. People are talking. They think I don't care what they think," he cut in, his tone firm. "But I do," she whispered, her throat tight. "I'm not built for this kind of attention. I can't live my life in other people's rumors." For the first time since she'd met him, something in Adrian's composure cracked. His jaw flexed, his shoulders stiffened, but his eyes softened, carrying an ache she hadn't expected. "Do you know what people said about me when I was starting out?" he asked quietly. "That I was too young, too reckless, that my family didn't have the pedigree, that I would fail." He stepped closer, his voice steady but low. "I learned early that the world will always have something to say. If you let that dictate your choices, you'll spend your whole life living for their approval instead of your own." Lena blinked, caught off guard by the raw honesty in his words. He had never spoken about himself, not like this. He drew a slow breath, his gaze fixed on hers. "You asked me to pretend once. To give you something real, if only for a moment. And I did. But this," his hand lifted slightly, almost reaching for her before pausing. "This isn't pretend for me." Her heart slammed against her ribs. The ballroom seemed to still, the soft hum of lights and movement fading until all she heard was his voice. His truth. And for the first time, Lena wondered if she had been wrong. Maybe this wasn't about surviving the noise of others. Maybe it was about choosing whose truth she trusted, hers or the world's. The ballroom shimmered like a dream. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across the room, champagne glasses clinked, and a sea of gowns and tuxedos flowed beneath the music of a live orchestra. It was the kind of night Lena had once only seen in magazines, never imagining she would be here. Not as a guest, not even as staff, but as someone who had shaped it into being. Yet instead of pride, her heart beat with unease. She moved among the tables, checking every detail, her black dress catching the glow of the lights. Everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her. Donors glanced curiously, colleagues whispered behind delicate smiles. The rumors hadn't died, they had only dressed themselves up for the evening. And then she saw him. Adrian stood near the stage, perfectly composed in a tailored tuxedo, greeting a senator with his usual quiet authority. But when his gaze shifted and found hers across the room, it was as though the crowd dissolved. His eyes didn't waver, didn't skim past her the way powerful men often looked through those beneath them. They lingered, steady and unashamed. Her breath caught. When the speeches began, Lena retreated to the back of the ballroom, content to fade into the shadows. She told herself it was safer there, no whispers, no watchful eyes, no chance of being noticed. But then Adrian's voice filled the room. "Tonight," he said, standing at the podium, "is about more than generosity. It's about connection, the kind that reminds us why we give, why we care, why we need each other. His words were smooth, eloquent, but Lena felt the weight of them in her bones. Because as he spoke, his gaze kept drifting, always finding her. It was subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice, but she felt it. Every glance was a thread tying her to him. And then, as the applause swelled and the orchestra began to play again, Adrian did something she never expected. He left the stage. He moved through the crowd with the same calm stride he always carried, but his destination was clear. People turned as he passed, some whispering, some stunned into silence. And then, before all of them, donors, colleagues, reporters, he stopped in front of Lena. Her breath stilled. "Adrian," she whispered, too soft for anyone else to hear. Without hesitation, he reached for her hand, his fingers warm and sure against hers. "No more pretending," he said, his voice low but certain. And then he pulled her into his arms. The world seemed to pause. Gasps rippled through the crowd, cameras clicked, voices buzzed. But none of it touched Lena. All she felt was the strength of his embrace, grounding her just as it had that first night in the rain. Only now, it wasn't born of loneliness or desperation. It was real. Her arms slid around him, and she let herself lean into him fully, no longer ashamed, no longer afraid. Adrian lowered his head, his voice brushing her ear. "You asked me once to pretend. But this, Lena, this is the only truth I want." Her eyes stung, but she smiled against his shoulder, her heart steady for the first time in weeks. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving the storm. She was standing in the light, seen, held, chosen. And she knew, without doubt, that her life had changed forever.